Yvonne.
Yeah.
Good morning. So, imposter syndrome. It's one of the things that we hear about a lot, something that often we talk about. It's something that there's articles written about, something that we hear about on podcasts. But we don't always think about it in the context that it really does impact. So it impacts us, of course, individually, but it also impacts the organizations that we work in. As HR professionals, we can recognize the symptoms, the signs, we can recognize the downstream effects of imposter syndrome a lot of times with people, but when we think about our organizations as a whole, oftentimes we don't think about how imposter syndrome can actually impact that as well. So before I get started, just have a quick question for you. As we go through this session, for the next 50 minutes that we'll be here together, you have three options. You can just sit and listen to me talk. I kind of get bored hearing my own voice, to be honest with you. You also have an opportunity to participate in this. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to have a number of polls, number of ways for you to interact. So if you were to scan the QR code on the screen, you'll be able to interact. Or some of you may just say, I'm just glad I'm not at work right now, so let me just kind of sit here and chill. But if you'd like to participate, go ahead and click into the QR code and let me know how you want to spend the next 50 minutes of time that we have together. Also, with that QR code, I know that a lot of times you want to take pictures of the slides. So on your phones, as I go through the presentation, the slides will come up on your phone as well, so you can take screenshots there. They tend to be a lot clearer when you do it directly on your phone versus taking a picture of the screen. So it looks like we want an engaged experience, an interactive experience, so I'm excited to see that. That always makes for a better experience for all of us together. So I'll give you a few more seconds as this poll closes out. Thank the one person who wants to sit and listen to me talk. That's awesome. All right, let's go ahead and go into the content. So I love this quote when I talk about imposter syndrome, and I'm going to use this to frame up what we'll talk about, and I'll also come back to it a little bit later. But you see the quote on the screen, and that's Ta-Nehisi Coates. And Coates says, "You exist, you matter, and the stories that you tell yourself determines how you move through the world." And here's the reality when it comes to imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is very heavily driven by the stories that we tell ourselves. So the question that I want you to think about as we go through this, is you think about your organization, whether it be leaders on your team, whether it be leaders in your company, whether it's maybe you yourself. What stories are being told? What are the stories that the leaders are telling themselves? What are the stories that you're telling yourself about do you belong? Should you be in the room? Are you the right person? Can you do what's being asked of you? Those are typically the things that will trigger imposter syndrome to come about. So as HR professionals, we're pretty familiar with these symptoms that we see of imposter syndrome. We see symptoms like burnout. We see symptoms like exhaustion. We see symptoms like disengagement. We see symptoms like higher turnover rates, people leaving the organizations at high clips. We see symptoms of employees being at work but not actually being in work. We see these things time and time again. We see these things consistently. We see where deadlines are missed, where targets are missed, where projects get derailed. We will frequently see these symptoms, but the reality is we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg because the root cause of those symptoms lies far below what we're seeing. The root causes of those symptoms are grounded in imposter syndrome and self-doubt because that's really what imposter syndrome thrives off of. Imposter syndrome thrives off of self-doubt. It thrives off of the voice in our head that pops up and those whispers that we hear. It's those feelings that we feel kind of in our gut, in our spirit. You know, I'm so glad that this session follows the flow session that we just did because it marries so closely, right? Those feelings of stress, those feelings of distress that Jessica was talking about. Those are the things that imposter syndrome creates in us. And when they manifest, it really can disconnect us from the work that we're doing, and it can create more opportunities for us to get distracted and move away from where we need to do. So those are really a lot of the issues that come with the imposter syndrome. So how many people you have at your organization It's going to really help us determine how much imposter syndrome is impacting you. So here's our next poll, and you'll have the answers there on your phone. So just kind of as a way to get a sense of who's in the room, how many employees do you have at your organization? Are you a smaller organization? Are you more mid-sized? Are you a larger organization? So it looks like we have a pretty decent balance in the room. And I think what we'll see is when we start to look at the actual impacts of imposter syndrome, the size of your organization matters because it hits in different places. It hits in different areas. And it connects differently depending, again, on your organizational size and the number of layers that you have within the organization. So, again, great mix, great balance that we have here. So when we look at the smaller organizations, so we're talking smaller, we're talking about less than 500 employees. At our smaller organizations, we often will see the impacts of imposter syndrome from an individual leader having a much bigger effect because the scale is much smaller. So it's important for us when we have smaller organizations to really be honing in on, are we supporting, are we giving our leaders what they need to grow and develop? And as we talk a little bit later about some of the solutions and some of the things that we can move towards as it relates to dealing with imposter syndrome, you can see where those direct impacts come into play. For our mid-sized companies, a lot of times we'll see that bottleneck happen at that middle tier of the organization. So anywhere, and depending on how your titling goes through your leadership hierarchy, anywhere from like a senior manager to a senior director. Somewhere in that area, that's often where we'll see imposter syndrome have the biggest impact because those are the ones at the organization that tend to be struggling the most. And at larger organizations, and a lot of it depends on how, again, you're doing your training, your development, your leadership development, the skills that your leaders may have to navigate through those, we'll often see that it can scale and it maybe departmentally we'll see bigger issues based on imposter syndrome than at the overall organization. So it's not just the imposter syndrome with the individuals, it cascades through the organization and it impacts it differently depending on your size. The other thing that impacts how imposter syndrome connects with your organization is when we look at the numbers as it relates to our overall workforce and then the segments of our workforce. So when I saw this study from Maryville University that was done a couple of years ago, it really, really jumped out to me. I have a background not only in leadership development, but also I did a lot of work in DE&I. And so I saw and experienced and heard the stories about the different populations. So our overall general workforce, 58% of people in the U.S. workforce have reported that they struggle with, that they encounter, that they navigate imposter syndrome on a regular basis. When we talk about our Black and brown employees, we talk about our more diverse populations, we see that at a higher number. What are some of the reasons why you think that our diverse team members may have higher incidences of imposter syndrome? Yes?
Because they can't always see themselves in that role.
Right. They may not always see themselves in elevated roles. They may not have seen the modeling before them. They may not be able to see how they can grow in their roles. What are some other reasons why we may see that in our diverse employees? Yes?
More pressure because they represent others like them.
Absolutely. The pressure of being an only or the pressure of being a few can really compound that imposter syndrome because it's not just the pressure of the job, it's not just the pressure of performing, but it's the pressure of representing for an entire group of people. So when we look at women, we see that they have an even higher incidence of imposter syndrome. 73% of women in the U.S. workforce represent that they are saddled with, that they struggle with, that they encounter, that they navigate through imposter syndrome. So why is it even higher for women? History, absolutely, right? When we look at historically, what happens? We've seen historically that as everything has moved forward, there's always a group that's lagging behind. Not because of qualifications, not because of effort, not because of anything else, sometimes other than just the traditions, than just the structures, than just the patterns, right? So all of those things come into play. And here's the other thing, and I know you've probably heard and read these studies, but there's so many studies about even the job application process, right? For our diverse employees and for our women employees and those who are looking for new and different jobs, a lot of times our diverse populations won't apply for jobs unless they feel as though they're 100% qualified and oftentimes overqualified for jobs. Whereas others will just apply and see what happens. Do you think imposter syndrome plays into that a little bit? Yeah, because when you look at a job description, if imposter syndrome is in your mind, you're thinking, oh, I haven't done that. Well, I can't do that. Well, what if I get asked about that? But the reality is, oftentimes, pushing through that imposter syndrome and putting yourself out there, that's where those opportunities will create, and that's where those opportunities exist. So who do we think, or who do we see imposter syndrome impact the most? So in the studies that I've done and the research that I've done, the people that I work with, it's been really interesting and has been supported by a lot of the articles and research that I've done around imposter syndrome. It is most commonly seen in people who have been high achievers or currently high achievers, and those that are in mid to senior level roles. And here's why that's so prevalent, and it's why it's so interesting, especially that mid to senior level leader. How many times in our work experience or people that we know or that we've heard of, how many times does someone get promoted to a job because they were good at their previous job? Yeah, how's that usually work out? Right? So there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't usually work out. And a lot of the reasons it doesn't work out is because if someone was a great individual contributor, they were great at doing the things that made them a great individual contributor. But then when they get elevated to a mid to senior level leadership role, they've been a high achiever before, but now when they're in this new role, they can't lean into those same skills to be that same high achiever. And so then doubt starts to creep in. The can I, should I, will I? Those things will start to creep into people's minds. And then the pressure of those roles is often greater than pressure that they felt before. So without any type of support, with any type of development, without that awareness and recognizing that those are the things that they're struggling with, oftentimes it can push them into that space of imposter syndrome. Often people who are newly promoted, so leaders that are 1 to 4 years in their new roles, a lot of times they'll experience imposter syndrome more than others for a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons is they haven't done it before. And a lot of times when they're in those rooms for the first time, they're reluctant to raise their hand and ask questions because they feel like if I'm in this room, I should already know this. But the reality is, curiosity is one of the biggest tools to being able to overcome imposter syndrome. Being willing to ask those questions, being willing to raise their hands. So I got a couple of questions prior to this session, and one of those was, what are some things that you can do physically to be able to overcome imposter syndrome? One of the strategies that I teach is when you're working with that situation and you may be stepping into a room that it's the first few times or you're not quite comfortable, be strategic about it. Be strategic about what you're going to accomplish in that meeting. Go into it with thinking, all right, I'm going to go into this meeting. The first thing that I'm going to do, the first thing when you step into the room is just take a step in and just pause. Show up early so you don't have people standing behind you, but step into the room and just pause and remind yourself, I'm supposed to be here. I was invited to be here. I have value in being here. Just that quick mantra can calm some of those nerves. But also go in with a plan. Have a question that you're going to ask, the specific question that you know that you want to ask, or have a specific insight that you know that you want to share, or a specific person that after the meeting you want to follow up with. So when that person is speaking, you're really dialed into what they're saying. So that way you can follow up with them with something specific. Like those little things can help people overcome imposter syndrome. So what does it look like? What does imposter syndrome look like? Because sometimes I'll talk with people and I'll say, you know, I'm known on LinkedIn as the imposter syndrome slayer. And that's where I focus a lot of my work, is working with individuals and teams around overcoming that imposter syndrome. They're like, well, what does that mean? What does it look like? So what it looks like is when people are in meetings that they've been invited into that they're supposed to be in and people are looking for their insights, they sit on their hands. And they're quiet. Or they just nod and smile. Any questions? Nope. Million questions in their head. Any questions? Mm-mm. So that's what it looks like. People not stepping up and speaking up. It often will also look like individuals that were those high achievers, that did stand out, that were confident, that were moving forward, and then all of a sudden they get into an elevated role and they just kind of freeze, or they just shrink, you're like, what happened to Jamie? Right? Jamie was crushing it before. We thought that Jamie was going to be amazing in that role. And now what? Like, has anybody seen or heard from Jamie? Not being willing to challenge things that we may have seen patterns of before, not being willing to challenge norms, not being willing to innovate, not being willing to take chances. Those are often things that make individual contributors outstanding. But then when they step into the space of being leaders, imposter syndrome tells them you can't do that anymore. You got to play it safe. But the reality is a lot of times we're put in those positions. Leaders lead through strategy and vision. Leaders don't lead through tactics, through techniques. I tell people all the time that when it comes to the work that I do, I can't tell you how to sell more widgets. I can't tell you how to move things on your spreadsheet because Excel is my kryptonite. But what I am is that I'm an expert in people. And I can tell you and teach you and show you and help you get your people to a place that they're leading their teams, that they're creating the environments of safety and psychological safety and security, that they're creating those environments and those cultures within organizations where people can thrive. And those things come through mitigating some of these challenges around imposter syndrome. Other things that we'll see the opposite spectrum sometimes of those who will kind of shrink into the background and try to find safety in the shadows. And we'll see people who will overwork, who will do too much. We'll see people who are overly perfect. We'll see micromanaging. We'll see leaders who are trying to make everything so perfect so that way nobody can say anything negative. How does that usually work out? Not so well, right? And a lot of times when we see that, we see people who are showing up kind of, puffing their chest. We see that false bravado. We see them showing up in a different way than they showed up before. We see them showing up in a way that can sometimes be frustrating to others, that sometimes can be confusing to others, and sometimes it can be toxic. So why does it happen? Why does imposter syndrome happen to people? It's a couple of simple things. It's the things, those thoughts in their minds, those fears. The fear of being found out, the fear of failing, the fear of not measuring up, the fear of not performing in the role that they're in. And oftentimes those fears are living where? Between their ears. Because the reality is, in most cases, I'll say 99% of cases, people want you to succeed. The people who have promoted you, they want you to succeed. The organizations, they want you to succeed. Your team, they want you to succeed. You know what's really difficult to see? Somebody flailing. Somebody struggling. It's hard to see that. Nobody wants that, right? If you're working for an organization that sets people up for failure, you may want to look for a different organization, because that's not going to be sustainable. So those fears that people have, that's the why. The other big why is the lack of awareness, the lack of self-awareness. And that's a big part of imposter syndrome as well, is people don't know that they're struggling with imposter syndrome. They don't know what it is that's getting them off track. They don't know what it is. They just think all the things that what's in their mind is telling them. They just think, I shouldn't be here. They just think this is tough. But that lack of self-awareness and recognizing, hey, this is just something that I'm going through. This is something that I'm navigating through, right? And there's a framework that I use, and I don't have a slide for it, but I'll share it with you. There's a framework that I use called Name It, Tame It, and Reframe It. And that is when you feel those fears come up, when you feel that anxiety come up, especially situationally, you're in situations and you know that something is feeling a little bit different, like be mindful of that, be aware of that, recognize that's imposter syndrome. So name it. And then now that I've named it, it's like, okay, so what's behind the fear? What am I afraid of right now in this moment? Because when I can identify what I'm afraid of, then I can tame it. Because I can rationalize in my mind, the likelihood is this is a bigger fear than its actual reality. One of my mentors has an acronym for fear. He says the fear is an acronym. False evidence appearing real, right? And a lot of times that's what it is. It's the false evidence. So when we can name it as imposter syndrome, we can tame it by recognizing this is just a fear that's probably much bigger than it's actually something that's going to happen. Then we can reframe it. And that reframing it is, let me use this experience to learn something. Let me use this experience to demonstrate something. Let me use this experience as a stepping stone. So by naming it, taming it, and reframing it, then you're able to move through a lot of times those paralyzing aspects of imposter syndrome. And then the pressure to perform, Again, it's often in our heads that's much greater than the external expectation or the external pressures that exist. So we talked about who's impacted by it. We talked about what's it look like. We talked about why. Let's talk about how. How can we see it? So from the outside looking in, we can see when we have leaders that may not make the decisions they may need to make. We can see them making maybe, I hate to use the E word of excuses, but sometimes that's what it is. Sometimes they'll make excuses. Sometimes they'll delay. Sometimes they'll continue to procrastinate, or they'll ask more questions than they need to. They'll try to gather more and more data before making a decision to move forward. They may hesitate to delegate, so they may want to keep everything here. That's what that micromanagement looks like. Because if I can control all the variables, if I can control all the information, if I can control all the data, if I can control everything that's coming in and going out, then I'm never in the dark. And as an individual contributor, that control was often my key to success. But now, as a leader, that's not what I should be focusing on. But they still may have that desire for control. We may see it on a different scale as well, where we can see that we have high potential leaders or high potential folks who could become leaders in the organization, but they shrink away from things like stretch assignments. They shrink away from things like opportunities to grow. They shrink away from things that can move them forward, and we can't figure out why. Like, why is it that you're not really wanting to move forward? What is it that's the disconnect there? A lot of times it's that imposter syndrome. Can I? Will I? What does it mean if I try and fail? Because the stakes can be higher in their mind than they are in reality. And then those toxic managers that may be operating out of fear. Those are the ones that, as HR folks, those are the ones that are really the individuals that can cause us issues, because they can cause legal and risk issues on the team. The more toxic their behaviors are, the more toxic that they are as leaders. So when we talked about the who, the why, and the how, so again, get a chance for you to interact. So if you could think about one of the current impacts of self-doubt in your organization, if you could put it into one word, what would that be? So if you go ahead and fill that out, we should see a word cloud popping up here on the screen. What are some of the current impacts of self-doubt in your organization? Yep, pretty common ones that I'm seeing. Paralysis by analysis, people being withdrawn, being risk averse, lost opportunities, things aren't clear. Yeah, a lot of times when we're operating out of fear, when we're operating in that imposter syndrome space, we don't communicate very well because we don't know what to communicate, or we're afraid to communicate anything other than just the clear basics that everybody knows. People not stepping up, low confidence, hesitancy. Stagnation, yep, I see that. So yeah, when you look at all of these things and when you think about it in the context of your organization, you think about it in the context of how you can grow and how you can support your teams, and you think about the opportunities and the opportunities lost that are impacted by imposter syndrome, it's pretty significant. All right, got another second. All right. So here's one of the big things that fear does. And I've talked about leaders a lot because that's kind of the space that I focus in. And you see that when we're looking and thinking about leaders and how we're developing our leaders and creating our leaders, one of the things that we want to do is we want to build confident leaders. We want to build brave leaders. When I talk with organizations, a lot of times, and especially when I talk with teams, not necessarily leaders, when I talk with teams, that's the one thing that I consistently hear that they're missing in their leaders, is I want my leader to be courageous. I want my leader to be someone who I can look up to and know that they have my best interests at heart. I want a leader who's not going to be afraid to speak up when they need to speak up. Like that courage in leaders, that's something that can be built. But oftentimes, without any type of investment in building that up and developing that, people get stuck in fear. And so when we have a confident leadership culture, we see the things that we're looking for. We see faster decisions. We see better collaboration. We see stronger teams. We see innovation because strong leaders generate that and they encourage that. When we have fearful leaders, then we have leaders that will sit on their hands. We'll have leaders that are afraid to make decisions. We'll have leaders who will lead their teams that way. Think about if you were on a team that was led by a courageous leader versus a team that's led by a fearful leader, how would that impact how you show up every single day? If you have a fearful leader, how likely are you to say, hey, I think we could do that better? Probably not very likely. Hey, well, what if we tried this? Probably not going to go anywhere. But if you're on a team led by a courageous leader will say, let's try it. Let's see what happens. Courageous leaders recognize that that's the space where companies grow. That's the space where careers grow. That's a space that cultures become strong and sustainable. It's through courage. And so when we see the differences between the two, we want to continue to find ways that we can build that confident leadership culture. So some things that are also impacted. So growth of the organization. So growth is stifled by fearful leadership. And when we think about fearful leadership, those who aren't willing to make some of those decisions that we're looking for, that are more willing to shield their team than to actually amplify and elevate their team. We'll see teams that are more interested in only doing the same things that they've done over and over and over again, and always looking for permission, always seeking permission to do things. Like every courageous leader that I've worked with has always gone by the mantra of asking for forgiveness and not permission. Freedom within the framework. So I'll talk about one of my best leaders that I ever had, Teresa. I'll talk about her a little bit later. But when I started working with Teresa, that was one of the first things that she told me. She said, John, we have a structure, we have a process, we have a flow, and you have freedom within the framework to make it work. You have the ability to innovate. You have the ability to add on. You have the ability to do things in ways that work for you as long as it works for the organization within that framework. Where does that come from? That comes from a place of confidence. Because Teresa knew that as confident as she was, she could then convey that confidence to the rest of us. And for the rest of us on the team, it was so freeing. Because not only did we know that we had that freedom, but we also knew that she had our back. And that's one of the things that courageous leaders will do. And that's how we were able to grow as a team and as an organization, because we weren't stifled by that fear. So retention is another one of the big things that HR, I know you all have to deal with on a regular basis. And when we think about retention, instead of thinking just about the numbers, let's focus on some of the causes. So some of the causes that create retention issues is when we have leaders that will micromanage. People who are working with a leader that is micromanaging, how quickly are they wanting to get off of that team? Pretty quickly, right? Because what's the number one thing that micromanaging conveys? Lack of trust, absolutely. So if I'm working for a manager, if I'm working for a leader who is not demonstrating any trust and is micromanaging everything that I do I think that I can grow in that role? Do I think that I can grow in that organization? Do I think that I can grow in my position? So what am I doing? You're wasting time. And when you're not wasting time, what are you doing? You're looking for a job, right? You're interviewing. You're trying to find another environment that's going to be more supportive. So that creates an issue for us in retention. Also, if I'm on a team and I'm doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, and I'm not able to grow, and I don't see new opportunities coming my way because I have a fearful leader that's holding everything close to their chest. Do I want to stay in that role and keep doing that job, or what do I want to do? I want to try to find somewhere else where I too can grow my career, when I can do things differently. And then we know about the cost of replacing someone, right? It's the age-old thing. It's a lot cheaper to keep someone than it is to replace them. So when you look at the actual data, and you look at the actual numbers, it's pretty ugly. So one of the things that I share here on the screen, each replacement, every time you have to replace someone, it costs about 6 to 9 months of salary of that existing employee that was there. And that 6 to 9 months, that counts the acquisition, that counts the recruiting, that counts the onboarding, that counts lost time and revenue from those individuals no longer being there and someone new coming into that role. There's so many costs that are included in replacing an employee when keeping them would have been much cheaper and much more efficient. The other things that we lose, in addition to the financial aspects, we lose the individual and everything they were bringing to that role. So when we lose our high potential performers, we're impacting not just that team, but we're impacting our future pipelines. We're impacting the organization years down the road because now we've got to start from scratch with someone else. So our star performers are always looking to be challenged, always looking for those next opportunities. You know, when I talk with leaders and I ask them, so if you had 3 buckets, if you had high performers, you had mid-level performers who are doing their job and they're just, they're floating along, they're good. And then you got your bucket of low performers. I ask leaders, where should you be focusing most of your time and attention? What do you think they say? They say the low performers, right? Because they're trying to drag everybody along. Come on, if you just would do what I ask you to do. They're trying to drag those low performers up to where? To the middle? Right? But where do we want our leaders to be focusing? High performers. Exactly. Because our high performers are hungry. Our high performers want to be fed. Our high performers want to grow. Our high performers want next. And so when we have leaders that are focusing on those low performers and not the high performers, or we have high performers that aren't getting what they need in those moments, what do? Out the door. And when we lose them, not only are we losing them, their talent, we're also losing all their knowledge. We're losing everything that they learned about the organization, about the role, about the team, about the culture. And when we lose those high performers, it's not just losing that one person. We're taking a hit across the whole team. And then also, when we're thinking about the future of our organizations, when we lose those high performers, we've just lost a key component of our leadership pipeline, right? So when we're looking at our talent landscape, when we're looking at our org charts, when we're looking at our teams overall, like we should have a really clear idea of who the next folks are in our leadership pipeline. And if we start to see that people from that leadership pipeline are dropping off, it may not be because they're just finding other opportunities elsewhere, right? A lot of times happy people don't look. And oftentimes, depending on your organization, people who will leave because they think the grass is greener somewhere else, if your culture is strong, if the leaders are strong, then they'll want to come back because they recognize maybe it wasn't so great. Right? Money is a false motivator. I say that all the time. People think, oh, everyone's just going to leave for money. I know people who have taken less money to be happy. Right? Money can't buy you happiness. They can rent it for a little while, but money cannot buy happiness. And if everything else is miserable, then guess what? They're going to want to come back to where they were happy. So we also lose, again, some of the structural elements. So we lose kind of the understanding of how things work at the organization. So we lose some of those delegation points. So when we lose those, we end up seeing, and this is a productivity thing as well, when people are leaving, when we have confusion, when there's a lot of transition, then we will see that people won't really understand how the processes work. They won't understand how the organization works. So we'll see some gaps in our pipelines. We'll see some choices and decisions that are made and missed at key junctures of our organization and key junctures of our work as our workflow processes. And then we also will see when people aren't getting the opportunities to grow and develop, we see the promotion opportunities are missed. So we may have a potential high performer that's kind of outgrown their role, but they have nowhere to go. And so they're stuck. And if we have confident leaders, we have leaders that are looking at things through a different lens, then we'll see that those promotion moments will tend to show up a little bit more frequently. And then the last thing that it really impacts is productivity. So when you think about the things that we already talked about, we think about retention, we think about courageous leadership, we think about innovation. If those things are missing, then what happens? Productivity grinds to a halt. Everyone's going through the motions. And it starts to impact the organization, starts to impact the bottom line, and then it also starts to impact the work that's being done. We see missed deadlines. We see people not connecting. We see people where we have opportunities to shine, but they want to shrink. And so the productivity slows down. So not only, again, do we see the individual impacts, but this is really where it becomes an organizational crisis. And a lot of times when we look at our spreadsheets and we look at the numbers and we wonder, why is revenue down this quarter? Sure, there's market conditions that contribute to it, but when we look internally, a lot of times the answers lie within our leaders. And those answers are our leaders confident? Are our leaders connected? Are leaders able to continue to show opportunity to their teams? Are our leaders stepping up the way that we expect them to step up? And if not, are we supporting them? I will frequently refer to HR as the answer ATM at organizations. And for most of us, when we go to the ATM, what are we doing? We're withdrawing, right? And so a lot of times as HR, you end up just being that withdrawal ATM. People will come to you for answers. Help me with this, fix this, struggling with this. But you're not getting those deposits. And so as the answer ATM, that can be a pretty exhausting experience all the time. And so I've seen and experienced HR leaders that are just extremely frustrated by being that answer ATM over and over and over again. And then you start to feel it from a transactional level as well, because you're seeing that churn of people. You're seeing that churn on the team. You're seeing people are constantly coming in and going back out, constantly going through that process. You see the performance is struggling and performance is lagging. And you see that you end up having cultural issues within the organization. The culture is struggling as well. So when we see this, where do these things usually land? When it comes to talent, when it comes to performance, when it comes to culture. Raise your hand if that lands on your desk. Pretty consistently, right? And again, back to that previous slide, now you're the answer ATM, and you're being looked to provide answers. And the reality is, in most cases, it's not a recruiting problem. It's not a talent problem. It's not an HR problem. It's a confidence problem. It's a confidence problem within your teams and within your leaders. So I actually just added this slide during Jessica's speech because it reminded me of something that, there you go. It reminded me of actually one of my favorite stories. So I mentioned Teresa before. Teresa was the best leader that I ever had. Brilliant, composed, could command a room, extremely personable, extremely, but also she connected with each individual, met them where they are. So when I was working on Teresa's team, because she was so amazing and continues to be, she got promoted. And so the next person up to get moved into her role was Shannon. And Shannon and I are very close. Shannon and I were peers at the time, and Shannon was getting promoted, or she had gotten promoted, and she was ready to announce the promotion. Teresa was ready to announce the promotion at our next team meeting. And so the night before, Shannon and I were having dinner, and I could just see that Shannon was going through it. It just, in her mind, she was, and she was even saying, she was like, John, I don't know how I'm going to follow up Teresa. Teresa is so awesome. Like, I'm not Teresa. And she was just starting to spiral. And I said, Shan, you got to save the hamster. And she looked at me and said, what? I was like, I can see that the hamster wheel is spinning, and that hamster is going. I said, if you're not careful, that wheel's going to keep spinning, but that hamster's going to be plastered to the inside of it. You have to save the hamster. And she had to step out of that fear because Shannon is brilliant. Shannon is amazing. Shannon is probably one of the best speakers that I've seen. And she can convey energy and attention in a room like none other. But at that moment, imposter syndrome was just all over her. And it was telling her, you can't be as good as Teresa. You're not going to lead like Teresa. The team is not going to follow you like they did Teresa. And my message to her was, you're not Teresa. You're Shannon. Be awesome at Shannon because we love Shannon. Be you. Be the best you that she, and forgive my language, but we would always say this when we had to coach ourselves. We're like, we teach this shit. Like this is what we teach. But sometimes we have to be able to get high on our own supply. And we have to recognize that we have to coach ourselves too.
Dropping gems,
And that's what she needed in that moment. So what have you all tried? What have you tried this year to overcome some of the challenges that we talked about, to overcome challenges around growth, around retention, around performances and productivity? What are some of the things that you've tried so far to overcome those challenges? So again, on your app with the QR code, go ahead and pop in and add those. All right, wellness, huge. Wellness is so important, so critical. Working on communication, working on connecting, nice. I love a book club, so that way you can start to have similar conversations around similar things. I love improving onboarding, that's so key, that's so important. All right, clearly I've hit on something because you have gone past the screen. I had to actually scroll down. So I love taking webinars, training, coaching, improving the culture, mentoring, all of those things, attending HR Tampa, whoever said that, good plug. All of those things are so critically important that you've tried. And I know some things have worked, and I know there's still some opportunities. So here's what I want to do. I want to share with you some of the things that I have found to be super valuable to move the needle. So the antidote or the cure for imposter syndrome, although it's not a full cure because it happens to everybody. One of the times that imposter syndrome jumped on my back was a few months ago. I was about to do a presentation for a chapter of ATD, so Association of Trainers and Developers. And it was like 5 minutes before, and I just started to hear the thoughts in my head. So you think that you're going to present to a bunch of trainers, and they're not going to be judging every single slide that you put up there? They're not going to be judging every do you think they're not going to be judging? And in my mind, I was like, but wait a minute. I was invited to speak there. I have information that they asked me to share. I have things that I know will be valuable. And so I had to use my own frameworks to move through that. So this is one of the frameworks that I use in addition to the Name It, Tame It, Reframe It that I showed you. So trust, influence, authority, and opportunity. So the first thing is trust. And trust starts with self-awareness. And the better that you can be about trusting yourself, the more that you can trust yourself and recognize that you have the capabilities, that you have the credentials, that you have something valuable, the more that you start to build that trust in yourself, that trust will build your confidence, and that trust will be recognized by others, that trust will be able to be visible, and others people will be able to experience that you are now trusting yourself more, and that's building your confidence. When you have trust, then you'll start to gain influence. I'm going to be very specific about the words that I use here. So when you have trust, then you start to gain influence. And when you gain influence with others, what that influence looks like, it's when they're starting to see that confidence showing up. They're starting to see that they can start to buy into you as a leader or start to buy into leaders at your organization. And as influence starts to grow, then people are granted authority. Now, authority is not power. Authority has nothing to do with an org chart. Authority has nothing to do with hierarchy. Authority is that feeling that you're drawn to someone, right? You want to know what they think. You proactively seek them out for their opinions, for their perspectives, for what they're bringing, for what they're sharing, because you believe in them. And as leaders, that's what we want our leaders to have. We don't want our leaders to have power. We want our leaders to have authority. Do you see the distinction between the two? Because when you have trust, when you have influence, and when you have authority, so you build trust to gain influence, you're granted authority, and then opportunities present themselves. And what those opportunities will do is those opportunities give you the chance to then have a greater impact on individuals as well as the organization. And those are the things that are transformational. That's where you really see the needle move when it comes to your organization, when it comes to individuals on your team. So I'm going to give you a couple more things here before we get out of here. So here are some 5 foundational pillars when we're looking at our organizations of how we can start to recognize and support and put some action to dealing with and navigating through imposter syndrome. The first things is we can start to recognize and intervene. So with recognition and intervention, we can see when people are struggling with some of those symptoms of imposter syndrome that I talked about off the top. And when we start to see those, we can be proactive about intervening with folks right away and say, hey, what's going on? Hey, we'd love to have a conversation with you. How can I help to support you? Right? When we start to see it, then we can start to act upon it. We also want to give them the tools, the resources, the training, the coaching, the support, the mentoring for leaders to step into that space. Because remember, as individual contributors, they're great individual contributors because they were great at being an individual. As a leader now, their responsibilities have grown. The spaces of influence they have grown. So it's a different skill set, different tools that they need in order to be success. Instead of being tactical and transactional, they need to become transformational. So through that support and development, that's one of the keys. Safety and vulnerability, that's a cultural thing. Creating a culture where it's okay to be vulnerable, where it's okay to ask questions, where it's okay to say those 3 ugly words, I don't know. When you create that culture and you sustain that culture, that comes from courageous leadership. That comes from a culture that you're setting up around safety and vulnerability and normalizing those conversations throughout the organization, normalizing conversations about being vulnerable, about being transparent, and about self-doubt. Giving people grace and space, letting people grow, letting people make mistakes. How did we learn not to put our hand on the hot stove? We got burned, right? But it's okay, because now what do we not do? You don't put your hand on the stove anymore, right? But we had that grace and we had that space to learn not to do that. And that's a big part of innovation. That's a big part of creativity. That's a big part of leaning into leadership. And then, this is one of the most, if not the most important one, is offering those clear expectations and then celebrating the wins along the way. The way that we build confidence is by celebrating incremental small wins. We don't just celebrate when we get to the finish line. Anybody an NFL fan or a football fan? Right? When someone gets a first down, individually, what do? They celebrate. They don't wait till they get to the end zone. That's their mini celebration. Now, if they score, then we see the big celebrations. But would it really be as exciting for the rest of the team that every time they got a first down, they just went back to the huddle and did it all over again? No. Celebrating those small wins is important. You celebrate the small wins on the way to the big wins because you're going to have a lot more small wins than big wins. But culturally, if you're celebrating the small wins along the way, that helps to build and sustain a strong culture. So of those 5 areas, which specific leadership behavior do you think at your organization could significantly mitigate the effects of imposter syndrome? Where can you see the needle moving the most if you focused on recognition, intervention, support and development, building up that culture, that grace in the space, or the clarity and celebration? Where would you see that the impacts would be mitigated? So I'm seeing a lot in the support and development. Good. That again, that's one of the areas that as an HR team, as an HR leader, throughout your organization, you can put those things into place. You have a lot of control over that support and that development of the people that are on your teams and the leaders within your organization and how you can support that growth. I'm going to close the poll a little quickly so that way I have just a couple of more slides that I want to share with you. But remember I said I was going to bring this back. This is the quote that I showed you off the top. But I changed what I emphasized. You exist, you matter, and the story you tell yourselves determines how you move through the world. The reason why I emphasize the and here is because by understanding everything that we've talked about, now you can control the story that you tell yourself because you have a better insight into what are some of the characters that are in the story, what are some of the things that are contributing to the story, and you can control it. You can have a better sense growing that self-awareness, growing that EQ. Those are all things that can help you to move through the world in a way that's more powerful and purposeful. So just 2 more slides before we get you out of here. So here's the reality. The bottlenecks that you have at your organization, they're not broken, they're just blocked. And you can move through those blocks by putting really intentional actions and intentional processes into place. And then finally, we've talked a lot about imposter syndrome and how you can see it. So I've developed a tool, an assessment that will allow you to be able to kind of answer, I think it's about 15 questions, to get a sense of what does imposter syndrome look like within your organization. So if you would like to do that, just go ahead and answer yes. If you think, I got everything that I need, thanks so much for the past 50 minutes, I am good, then go ahead and hit no. Thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate your time, your attention, and your engagement, and hopefully you can help us to move through and start to defeat imposter syndrome one step at a time. Thank you all.